On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was lynched in front of our very eyes. And the question that I want to ask today is, was he lynched in vain? Was the tragic lynching of George Floyd in vain? I wanted to do this show 2 days ago so that it would serve as some sort of semblance to the 3-year anniversary of his death. 2 days ago would have been at least June 25th. Because we just cannot allow that man's death to just be written off in the annals of history. It was in my lifetime the closest thing that I ever saw to the 1950s, 40s, 30s, 20s style lynching. We even have the sounds to associate with a lynching where they hung black men from trees. And the question that I'm asking is whether or not his lynching was in vain. Stay with me for a few minutes as we look back at the George Floyd lynching and see what progress has been made since then. Thank you, everybody. Yes, I want to take some time this evening and just sort of look back at the lynching of George Floyd. I tell you, I don't know if I've ever been so impacted by something that I saw on television, not in real time, but pretty close to it. And we just cannot let that lynching be in vain. We need to look back and see what progress has been made regarding social and racial justice. And then we need to work double time to make sure that his death is not in vain. So I'm going to talk about the George Floyd lynching. We're going to look back a little bit. I guess I should warn you that some of what you're going to hear is going to be disturbing. Like I said, I've been trying to do this for the past few days. Every time I would sit down and try to put all the elements of this lynching together, I would get stopped in my tracks because it's just so emotional. I mean, I started calling this a lynching long before other people started calling it a lynching, because that's what it was. The only difference is Mr. Floyd was not hanging in a tree by a rope around his neck. He was lying down on cold, hard cement with a white man's knee pressed on his neck. But the effect was the same, the absolute same. And again, it's just too important in American history for us to forget, or for us not to get some progress from it to further social and racial justice. So that's what I want to talk about. So let's look into it. Again, was George Floyd's tragic death, his lynching, was it in vain? Was it in vain? Has there been any progress since then? Well, I think we should start where this whole debacle started. It started on the streets of Minneapolis. Let's look there at some of what happened. Again, warning, some of what you're about to hear is very emotional. So prepare for this. You've heard it before, most likely, but hearing it again is almost as tragic as the first time that I heard this and saw this with my own two eyes. Here it is.
Restraint. Hobble. Okay. I'll grab that. Get him. Jesus. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Thank you. I can't breathe. Stop moving. Mama. Mama. Yeah, Mama. Mama. One of the front pouches. Mama. On my right side bag. Mama. Mama. You're the rest guy. All right. All right.
All right. So there it is. Just horrible. Just really, really, really terrible to hear this man repeatedly say, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. To hear him repeatedly call for his mother, mama, mama, mama. It has come out, and others have tried to say he wasn't really calling for his birth mother. He was calling for his girlfriend that he called mama. I don't know which is true. Either one is bad, right? The fact that this black man is lying there, begging for his life, calling out for the comfort of either his birth mother or his girlfriend, either one. And those 4 police officers were very callous and seemingly didn't care what Mr. Floyd was facing, what he was dealing with. When I listened to the tape, for me, again, I'm witnessing a lynching. And this time, unlike the pictures that we see of lynchings back in the 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, this particular lynching has sound to it. When we look at those pictures, we don't have any sound. In this instance, we have sound. And we hear what a black man is vocalizing as he's losing his breath. And the doctor's going to explain that here in just a second. But as he's losing his life, as less and less and less oxygen is reaching his brain because of the pressure that is applied to his neck, callously, we have a sound to it. So when you see those pictures of lynchings, think about what George Floyd is saying there on that cement, on that concrete street. And remember, it was exactly what Eric Garner, when he was being choked to death, it was exactly what he was saying. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Mama, mama, I can't breathe. That must have been what black men were saying as they were hanging from trees. And by the way, this nation just passed an anti-lynching law. Within the past couple of years, just enacted an anti-lynching law after the death of George Floyd. Now, what happened after that is also, to me, quite amazing. Watch this.
Really a firefighter?
Yes, I am from Minneapolis.
Okay,
Bro,
they get on the sidewalk.
You think that's okay?
Check his pulse.
Check his right
Charles, check his pulse. Get back in the sidewalk. The man ain't moved yet, bro. The man ain't moved yet, bro.
Okay, where? Minneapolis.
Okay, bro, you're a bum, bro.
One of the eyewitnesses to George Floyd's murder, the mixed martial artist.
So we see there was a crowd of people standing out there. By this point, Mr. Floyd had expired, but they're standing out there and they are begging for Mr. Floyd's life. As he was begging, they were begging. Check his pulse, bro. Check his pulse. Check his pulse. One of the white ladies standing there was an EMS worker, and she wanted to check his pulse, but she was forbidden to do so by the Asian officer. And we know from the trial that even after Mr. Floyd expired, Derek Chauvin continued to apply pressure to his neck. And folks are out there literally begging them, check his pulse, check his pulse. He can't breathe. he can't breathe, but they were so callous. And by the way, let me remind you, all of this started because of an alleged $20 bill, of an alleged fake counterfeit $20 bill. He allegedly, that wasn't even proven, he allegedly had or was trying to pass a $20 bill. That's what this was all about. All this tragedy, all this trauma, all that the country went through, the tens and tens of millions of dollars behind this matter, all occurred because a black man allegedly was trying to pass a fake $20 bill. And then once the police arrived, what then precipitated it to the next level? Well, again, the callousness, the disregard of life by those officers. Because Mr. Floyd said repeatedly, I have claustrophobia. I am afraid, deathly afraid to get in the back of that car. Can you please call a van? Can you please call an SUV? Can you please do that? And let me tell you, on a personal level, I completely understand that. We shared with you that our family was arrested for an alleged trespassing after we complained about being racially profiled. I think this was back in 2019. My family and I, after church, we went to a theater here in the Dallas area, and my daughter Chloe was treated very, very, very racist in a racial way. And when my wife and I got to the theater, we had just had dinner, so we were going to catch a movie. When we got there, I began to ask, why are you all treating us this way? Why are you, treating us like we are less than human? And mind you, white and Hispanic families were there getting great treatment. We were the only blacks there and just being treated horribly. And the general manager was a black guy. And when I saw him, we thought, okay, he will certainly understand this. Wow, he was worse. He said we were trying to play the race card, and he essentially called the police, and me, Chloe, Caleb were arrested, and they were about to arrest my wife over a fake trespassing allegation. So we were handcuffed, and they were trying to put me in the back of this little police car, and the back seat was probably a foot, deep. And I'm a pretty big guy, and George Floyd was bigger than me. I'm like 6'2". George Floyd is like 6'4", 6'5", I understand, he was. And his mind just could not conceive him being placed in that car, handcuffed. He just had a primal fear of death. And he told them that. So all they had to do was get a larger vehicle. Fortunately for me, when I told them, hey, look, this is just too small a space for me to get in, I was having the same reaction that Mr. Floyd was having. Fortunately for me, one of the supervisors who were there, they had all these cops there. One of the supervisors that was there said, hey, get an SUV. And so they got an SUV, and I, with no problem, got in the back of that SUV where it had a bunch of space, a whole bunch of space. That's all they had to do with Mr. Floyd. That was it. I'm so grateful they did it to me, because in my mind, I just couldn't see myself getting in the back of that police car. I mean, if they had tried to force me, I don't know what I would have done, because my mind was more in control. My sort of reptilian mind was in control, as it was with Mr. Floyd. So all they had to do was just get a larger vehicle for Mr. Floyd. He's a large guy. Get a larger vehicle. What is wrong with that? Why does that go against your police training? I mean, it's just treating someone civilly and humanly. I mean, it's just being humane. The man was only accused of passing a fake $20 bill. He wasn't accused of murder. He wasn't accused of rape. He wasn't accused of any of that. They said that he tried to get something with a fake $20 bill. He was not a danger to anyone. And you all have seen the tape of him saying, I'm not a bad guy. I'm not a bad guy. I'm just claustrophobic. I'm not a bad guy. Please, I'm not a bad guy. Don't hurt me. Don't shoot me. I mean you no harm. Please, I'm not a bad guy. You've heard that tape. But to them, that meant nothing. Absolutely nothing. This man's life was taken for no reason. Wow. And so what happened as a result of that? This is what happened. And this too is extremely riveting. This happened.
Justice for George!
I don't condone violence, but I understand it.
Justice!
What do we want?
Justice!
When do we want it?
What was astounding about that protest, and you see it was largely peaceful, is the fact that it was white, black, Asian, Hispanic, Arab, all types of people all over the world who were protesting what they saw. People finally saw and felt what African Americans had dealt with for centuries. America saw it for themselves. That was what helped catapult the civil rights movement in the 60s. The television cameras would show the mean, hateful, racist person sicking dogs, vicious dogs on black people who were simply trying to vote, or water hoses, or as Mimi Till said, she wanted America to see what they did to her boy, Emmett Till. When people can see what we deal with on a daily basis, I guess at that moment they feel a sense of solidarity. But does it amount to real change, real progress? Real reform? Not necessarily. And that's what we're going to look at. But before we do, I want you to hear now briefly the testimony of the expert that the prosecution used in Derek Chauvin's trial. And he tells us exactly what caused Mr. Floyd's death, which contradicts what the GOP, what conservatives say killed George Floyd. Here is the expert.
So let's talk about your opinions with respect to this case. Have you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty on the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes, I have.
Would you please tell the jury what that opinion or opinions are?
Yes, Mr. Floyd died from a low level of oxygen, and this caused damage to his brain that we see, and it also caused a PEA arrhythmia that caused his heart to stop.
And by PEA, you mean pulseless electrical activity?
Correct. It's a particular form of an abnormal beat of the heart, an arrhythmia, and a particular form of it.
Is this what some persons might refer to as asphyxia?
Yes, it has been called asphyxia. To me, it's not terribly helpful. It just, what we're really talking about is a low level of oxygen. Other people talk about hypoxia. That again is just a Latin term meaning a low level of oxygen. So all of this is just really other words for a phenomenon that is a low level of oxygen.
Have you formed an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to what the cause is or was for the low level of oxygen in Mr. Floyd?
Yes, I have.
Would you tell us what that is?
The cause of the low level of oxygen was shallow breathing. Small breaths, small tidal volumes, shallow breaths that weren't able to carry the air through his lungs down to the essential areas of the lungs that get oxygen into the blood and get rid of the carbon dioxide. That's the alveoli at the bottom of the lung.
So then what happened in the case of Mr. Floyd that relates to the shallow breathing that resulted in his low oxygen?
So there are a number of forces that led to that the size of his breath became so small. And so there are a series of forces higher up that are leading to that. And the main forces that are going to lead to the shallow breath are going to be that he's turned prone on the street, that he has the handcuffs in place combined with the street, and then that he has a knee on his neck, and then that he has a knee on his back and on his side. All of these four forces are ultimately going to result in the low tidal volume, which gives you the shallow breaths that we saw here. And so the air will not...
All right, so you heard the expert. He was a pulmonary doctor. He looked at Mr. Floyd's medical records, the autopsy, and he expressed his opinion to a certain degree of medical certainty. Those are legal terms that an expert, a medical expert must express pursuant to the law in order for their opinion to be an expert opinion. And notice what he said. He said essentially that Mr. Floyd died because his brain was not getting enough oxygen. And so then the prosecutor asked, well, why wasn't his brain getting enough oxygen? And the doctor said, because of shallow breaths. And then the prosecutor said, well, why were his breaths shallow? And the doctor said, well, there were four forces. One, he was laying prone, face down on his stomach. Pressure was being applied from the cement. You know, cement doesn't give. Couple that with the fact that his hands are handcuffed behind him, which is, again, applying pressure to his lungs. And then, on top of that, Derek Chauvin had his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, and one of the other officers had a knee on Mr. Floyd's back. Those four things caused shallow breath, and because the breaths were shallow, Mr. Floyd's brain and vital organs were not getting oxygen, the requisite amount of oxygen to his lungs and other vital organs. So his cause of death was not any sort of drug in his system, any sort of precondition, medical condition. The doctor dispelled every bit of that at a certain degree of medical certainty. This doctor, who was well qualified, he would have never been able to testify because the defense would have tried their best to disqualify him as an expert, but he was unassailable. There was no way that they could do what we call a Daubert challenge. There was no way that they could do that with this man. He was well qualified to offer his medical opinion. So despite what Candace Owens says, despite what other conservatives say, Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck and the knee of the other officer and being in a prone position with his hands handcuffed behind him created shallow breaths, which caused him not to get a requisite amount of oxygen. point blank. That was the cause of Mr. Floyd's death. And that all led to the conviction of Derek Chauvin and the conviction as well of the other 3 officers in both state and federal court. So that's what Mr. Floyd dealt with. The question that I'm asking, and before we go on, let's have a moment of silence for Mr. Floyd, his daughter, his family. Thank you. Okay, so let's now answer the question. Has there been any real national police reform since Mr. Floyd's death? And by the way, thank you all for the comments that are coming in. Thank you, my good friend Lawrence Stokes, for your comments. We'll come back to those in just a minute. Thank you, Mr. Green, for your comment. We'll come back to all of that in just a second. I'm answering the question, has there been any real national police reform? All right, so according to the New York Times, over 30 states passed more than 140 new police oversight and reform laws, according to a New York Times analyst of data from the National Conference of State Legislatures. So, shortly after Mr. Floyd's death, I think within about a year, 30 states passed certain police oversight and reform laws. So on the state level, yes, some reform was implemented by these states. Now, here are the states that implemented the police reforms. The states that are in the dark colors. You see the states out west, you see the states out in the Midwest, the lower Midwest, or what you might call the Southwest, and then states in the Northeast, and a few states there like Illinois, I think Michigan is in that crowd. But you come down south, you see most of those states implemented or enacted no police reform laws. North Carolina did not, my home state. South Carolina did not. Georgia did not. Alabama did. And I don't know, I can't remember what that other state is over there. I think it's either Tennessee or Arkansas. I think it's Arkansas, actually. Implemented some reform. And then the lighter blue state there, I believe that's Oklahoma, some slight reform. But for the most part, the South did nothing. Now, are you surprised by that? No, because the South is the home of the Confederate. The South is the place where slavery occurred and Jim Crow occurred. That doesn't mean the rest of the country is not racist, but the South is the seat bed of this white supremacy that we have fought for 400 years. And they did nothing, despite George Floyd begging for his life, despite the evil that we saw in Derek Chauvin's eyes and the evil that we saw with the other officers. These states were not moved by that at all. All right? The New York Times article says, quoted Amber Widgery, I think I hope I'm pronouncing her name correct, Widgery, a policy expert, said many of the laws restricting the use of force, overhauling disciplinary systems, installing more civilian oversight, and requiring transparency around misconduct cases give states far more influence over policing practices that have typically been left to local jurisdictions. So we applaud those states that passed some reform laws. The question, though, has any real national police reform been done? And the answer to that is no. We'll see that in just a minute. We're seeing the creation of really strong centralized state guidance that sets a baseline for police accountability, behavior, and standards for all departments. So Ms. Widgery is quite complimentary of the states who enacted these reform laws, and I am too. We thank God for every little bit we get to prevent seeing and experiencing another George Floyd. But it's not enough, because this is the one that we need. We need the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That was named in George Floyd's honor, and it has national import, not just statewide. It has national import. And more importantly, it gets to the heart of the matter. And I want you to just look me in my eyes, and I want to look you in your eyes as I talk about what's really needed to prevent more George Floyd scenarios. It is the abolishment of qualified immunity. It is the abolishment of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a law. It's not a statute. It is a law that was created by the U.S. Supreme Court that essentially says police officers are immune. They have qualified, not absolute immunity like judges, but they have qualified immunity. But don't be misled by the word qualified, because qualified is a high standard. The court has made that a really high standard. Essentially, you have to show a family who sues a police officer in civil court, and we haven't even talked about criminal court. Let me just quickly say, in criminal court, the first thing has to happen is the officer has to be arrested. We have done these cases, and it's very difficult to even get an officer arrested. And before many states, before the officer is arrested, the officer gets 2 or 3 days just to kind of get his story together. And then he talks with the investigator. And even if the officer is arrested, then the prosecuting authority has to present the case to the grand jury, and the grand jury has to return an indictment, which doesn't happen much at all. At all. Grand juries typically do not indict police officers, no matter how horrible it looks. But even if he's indicted or she, and it ends up going to trial, most often they are acquitted. They are found not guilty. Philando Castile was in complete compliance. The officer shot and killed him simply because of fear. He feared that, according to him, he feared for his life because he knew Philando Castile was armed, and he just shot him. We all saw that too. The Philando Castile's girlfriend was Facebook living. She was live streaming it on Facebook when he shot Philando Castile. We've seen other examples. I'm trying to think of the gentleman in Oklahoma who was standing with his hands up, and a woman shot him in the side and killed him. Terrence Crutcher, I believe his name was. We saw Walter Scott getting shot in the back. We saw Tamir Rice being shot within seconds of officers pulling up because he had a fake gun. We know here in this area about Botham Jean, who was shot by a police officer who claimed that she mistakenly thought that he was in her apartment. That officer was found guilty and is sentenced for 10 years for the murder of Mr. Jean. This is my home here. I knew the prosecutor. I know the prosecutors who did that case, and they did a great job. Jason and Laquita, great job on that case. And Dallas has gotten other cases of police officers convicted, but it is rare. It is rare. Fort Worth recently also got a conviction of a police officer. So the DFW area has seen some progress with this, but around in most other jurisdictions around the country, no. The criminal court, for various reasons, is just not good at prosecuting police officers. And think about it. I mean, you got the district attorney's office that works with the police on a daily basis, handling the prosecution. I mean, that's a conflict of interest right there from the jump street, right? And then the U.S. Supreme Court has handed down these cases that protect them in criminal court. So getting a criminal conviction of a police officer has about as good a chance as a snowball in hell of surviving. Let me just tell you that, all right? So most of the time, your only hope is holding the officer accountable in civil court. And you file the lawsuit, okay? We are about to file one in the next couple of days. You file the lawsuit, and one of the first things the defense is going to do is file a motion to dismiss, or they're going to file a summary judgment motion, and they're going to plead, guess what? Qualified immunity. They're going to say this police officer has qualified immunity. Now, let me show you how hard it is to overcome qualified immunity. All right, so let's go back to George Floyd. We saw him being choked to death for the reasons the doctor explained. In order to overcome qualified immunity, what the plaintiff has to show is that there is a similar previous case or set of circumstances that are similar to the case at hand. So unless there is someone that the police has choked to death with a knee on the neck of somebody, and while handcuffed, while face down, unless there's almost an exact replica of those set of circumstances, that the officer then would know that this is a dangerous situation and that he shouldn't have done that or shouldn't have done that, then there's a good chance that the judge is going to dismiss that case on the basis of qualified immunity. You see how high that standard is? So again, if a police officer shoots someone under a set of circumstances, let's say we call those circumstances A, in order to overcome qualified immunity, the plaintiff, the attorney representing the family, has to find a very, very similar case and show the judge, here's a similar case that shows that this set of circumstances was dangerous to put our family's loved one in. So here is a precedent that should overcome qualified immunity. Well, some of these circumstances are so unique that it's hard to find a similar case. So what happens to your case is thrown out because of qualified immunity. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act is intended to overcome or to abolish qualified immunity. And so they had this thing worked out in the House. The House voted to approve it in 2020. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020. The House passed H.R. 7120, but Senator Tim Scott represented the GOP in the Senate and said the GOP wouldn't support abolishing or limiting qualified immunity. And oh, by the way, Tim Scott is currently running for president. Tim Scott, the first African-American senator who was voted into the Senate since Reconstruction, was the man who essentially said, we're not going to support the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act of 2020 because we don't want to abolish or limit qualified immunity. Tim Scott, who's running for president right now, okay, who's going to try to get many of you to vote for him. All right? He's going to try to get many of you African Americans to vote for him. All right? So, the House passed this in 2020. They passed it. Got to the Senate? No. All right? So, 2021, the same bill is reintroduced. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021. Almost the same thing happened. The House passed it, H.R. 1280. But again, Senator Tim Scott said the GOP Senate wouldn't support abolishing or limiting qualified immunity. Because that's the biggie. Why is it so big? It's big because if an officer knew that he would face a civil judgment that could take house, that could take pension, that could take car, that could take savings, that could cost him everything. If he knew that before choking somebody to death or shooting someone to death under questionable circumstances, he would think twice, or she would think twice. And that would save lives. That would save lives. If Derek Chauvin knew that qualified immunity had been abolished or limited, he would not have stayed on George Floyd's neck like that. Neither one of the other officers. Why, in other words, are these officers oftentimes so arrogant? Because they know they're most likely not going to be prosecuted in criminal court, and they won't be held accountable in civil court. Now, what Tim Scott did, let's go back to him for a minute. Tim Scott, he tried to come up with a compromise. He said, hey, let's abolish qualified or limit qualified immunity with regards to the police department. Not to the officer, to the police department. In other words, let's hold the police department accountable, not the police officer. That was the compromise that he and the GOP proposed. Well, why doesn't that work? That doesn't work because it leaves the situation as it was before, which is the officer is not accountable. The accountability needs to be on the officer, not just putting it over on the police department or the city. They need to be accountable too, because most likely those officers are following some sort of citywide or police department custom or policy. So yes, they are accountable too. But the accountability also must be shared by the police officer because he's the one or she's the one in the streets with the gun or choking somebody to death or applying some sort of maneuver. So it was no, like, no, that's a no starter. That's a non-starter. That's a no-brainer. What is the point of abolishing or limiting qualified immunity if it doesn't apply to the police officer, who's the one who's actually on the streets? These cities who employ these police officers, they're used to paying out civil judgments. I mean, some of these cities pay out hundreds of millions of civil judgments. That doesn't really rock them. They just use our tax money to pay off those judgments. That's no deterrence. We need deterrence that is applied to the police officer, him or herself. So the Tim Scott compromise was really no compromise at all. So the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2021 passed by the House, stuck in the Senate. And no matter what those state laws do, they're good, don't misunderstand me. Some of them are good. Some of them may help and save some lives, and we are grateful for every life that is saved, okay? But to really get to the root of this, qualified immunity should be abolished or limited. And I tell you, there's this talk about defunding the police. And, you know, GOP will co-opt the term and twist it and make it mean all sorts of things. And they've done that with defunding the police. Defunding the police just simply means taking some of the funds that police departments get across the country and giving some of that money to other agencies that can provide some help, some support to people who most often end up having those interactions with the police. In other words, for example, strengthening maybe mental health units, or developing or creating mental health units in a city. That's very worthwhile. That needs to be funded, because a lot of times it is mental illness that brings cops into interaction with the Black community. All right, so that's very worthwhile. That's not really defunding the police. It is funding an agency that can assist the police and hopefully lead to less lethal outcomes for Black Americans. So abolishing or limiting qualified immunity is the real deal. That is what needs to happen. Again, yes, the state laws, all well and good. But nothing will deter these police officers like knowing you pull that trigger, you apply that choke move, and if it's found that you did it unlawfully, you could lose everything. That would get their attention. And why is that deterrence important? It's important because policing started wrong. It started hunting Black people during slavery. When you start that way, it is very difficult to correct things later. It started wrong. And there are a lot of people a lot of cops who come into the profession with implicit biases. Some are just outright racist. And let me say this as I come to a close. We saw five Black police officers beat Tyree Nichols to death. And according to Sir Paul Butler in his book, Chokehold, it is Black police officers who are more apt to apply deadly force to Black men. So it is oftentimes white officers on Black men or women, but a lot of times it is, now most of the times the cops who kill Blacks are whites. But according to Paul Butler, Black cops are more apt to kill Black men. Well, whoever's doing it, it needs to be stopped. There need to be deterrence. Abolishing and or limiting qualified immunity, that's the big one. That's the big one. And it could be done even now if Joe Biden and the Democrat-led Senate just simply did something to the filibuster rule. That's all they need to do. Just tweak the filibuster rule so that they can just pass this act with a simple majority instead of having to overcome a filibuster, which would require that they get 10 votes from the Republican Party, which they're not going to get. And it's not like the Republican Party is so pro-law enforcement. We saw that January 6, 2020, when a bunch of GOP folks showed up at the Capitol building and committed all sorts of violence against police officers. Right? We saw that too. So when we asked the simple question, was the tragic lynching of George Floyd in vain? I wouldn't say it's completely in vain, and there's nothing that we could do to bring him back or to, sort of make his death meaningful. There's nothing we could do. But my God, if his life was taken in such a tragic way, we ought to get something meaningful from it. Dr. King was a completely innocent man when he was murdered, when he was assassinated. And shortly after his death, major civil rights legislation was signed into law that has had a huge impact on the African American community. So far, Mr. Floyd's death has not resulted in meaningful nationwide police reform. So I'm saying that we need to double our efforts to get this bill passed so that we can begin to see some true deterrence on the streets and can save some Black lives, because Black lives matter. And we think the Black Lives Matter movement, despite whatever missteps there may have been, though that movement has pushed the needle. That's why we got those 140 laws passed in those 30 states, because of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, to get true, real, national police reform done, we need qualified immunity to be either abolished or limited. And in order to get that done, the Senate just need to simply just tweak the filibuster rule so that Kamala Harris can do the deciding vote and get this done. It can be done just that simply. All right? Thank you for sharing this time with me. I could not go past this year without remembering what we all experienced, and shall I say suffer, the trauma that we suffered, watching Mr. Floyd get lynched the way he did. Okay? All right, yes. Comments. My wife wanted me to get to the comments as I promised. Thank you, sweetheart. Lawrence Stokes, my good friend. Why did it take this long to sign that bill? I think Lawrence is talking about the anti-lynching law. Did it take the death of George Floyd, or was it the fact that this went viral? Lawrence, I believe it took this long because we live in a very deeply racist country. Very, very, very deeply racist country. You remember in South Carolina when that Charleston shooting occurred, it was only after the death of those 9 people that South Carolina removed that racist Confederate flag off its state capitol. You remember, it was a black woman who, Bree Newsom, I think her name is, who climbed that flagpole and brought it down. So yeah, I think it's because we just live in a deeply racist country, deeply, profoundly racist, who oftentimes will not give an inch to the demands, the cries, the trauma, the tragedy of Black people. And it's the reason why voting matters, because we can't depend on their goodwill or their grief or any. We can't depend on that. We have to force change. We have to force it. We have to make it happen. Mr. Green says, I think George had something on the officer from the club. That's why he did not let up. I heard that as well. Some folks suggest that they knew each other. I don't know. Didn't come out at trial, but, I don't know. He certainly didn't let up. My good buddy Lawrence says, the bombing of churches and houses, the media for the first time did its job on showing the brutality. Yes. And also thanks to social media for forcing main media to give certain things attention, right? But yeah, the media sometimes gets it right and report the news the way it should be reported. Although I still have strong misgivings with main media. It has a way of painting Black Americans in such a way that, still is very problematic. And then my wife says the abolishment of qualified immunity is what is really needed to get to the bottom of police misconduct. Absolutely, sweetheart. Thank you for that comment, and thank you for all the comments. And that's going to do it for me. Again, I don't want to hold you too long. I could sit here and just keep talking about this. This is what I live every day. But thank you for commenting. Please like, share, subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Go to our YouTube channel, The Defiant Lawyers, and subscribe. We need your support so that we can continue bringing out this information. Okay? That's going to do it. Thank you so much. You all have a good one. Have a good evening. And now, tomorrow, by the way, let me say this. Tomorrow, we're going to do another video, and we're going to talk about these racial gerrymandering cases that have come out from the U.S. Supreme Court this term. There have been 3 of them. We also may get the affirmative action case tomorrow, and we want to certainly review and analyze it. And so we very well may be coming back tomorrow, okay? Again, Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers, who each and every Saturday bring you a legal analysis of trending politics, policies, personalities, pop culture, to empower you with the information you need to defy this unjust legal system. Thank you for tuning in. I'm out. Peace, soul, hope, love. I got Don Kinnear's wrong, but you all know. Bye.